Just a few days ago, there was actually a Jewish holiday called Purim, or Purim. I'm not sure if I'm actually saying that right. I think it's Purim. And it comes from the book of Esther. Towards the end of it, you'll hear about it a bit. But it's a holiday they celebrate every year. And I have a friend who's a Jewish rabbi that I spoke to about this recently. And he's over in Chico, and he said that what he loves about the book of Esther is that, because I commented to him that the book of Esther is the only book in the Bible that doesn't mention God. It doesn't explicitly say, and they talked to God, and God said this. He's not mentioned. And I thought that was curious, and a lot of the commentaries I saw mentioned that, and so I called him to ask about that. What's up with that? And he said that what he loves about the book of Esther and Purim is that it's an invitation to look for God, to look for his hand in things, to see how he's working in your life, how he has delivered you from something, to look for his hand at work. And it's a choice to choose faith. And I thought that was a pretty cool answer. So, for you, how many people, if you've read the book of Esther, just say Esther. Esther. Okay, a few. Let's try again. If you've read the book of Esther, say Esther. There we go. That was for my wife. She dreamed that I would do that. And there you go. You're a prophet, baby. See that? No. We'll start at the beginning here. We're going to go through it. We're not going to read the whole thing. We're going to go through some of the highlights, and we're going to see what God has for us around this. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to Esther. And we'll start at the beginning here. So Esther chapter 1, verse 1. Now in the days of Ahasuerus, which they believe is either Xerxes or Artaxerxes, is another name for him, who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and splendor and the pomp of his greatness for many days. I'm reading out of the ESV, by the way, so it may be slightly different if you're reading NLT or one of them. For many days, 180 days. It's a lot of feasting. They were feasting for a minute there. And when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen, and purple with silver rods and marble pillars, and also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. So he was giving it out generously. And drinking was in accord to this edict. There's no compulsion, for the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. So they're throwing this big party. This guy's he says, I love that it says the pomp, that he's basically showing off to all his people everything good he's got, all his goods, his riches, his royal glory and splendor. And it says at the end there that Queen Vashti also gave a feast. So remember Queen Vashti. We're going to talk about her some more. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded his, can't say half those names, I'm going to say his eunuchs, that's what it goes on to say there, who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with a royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. So the king gives this order. He said, hey, bring Queen Vashti out here. I want to show her off to my people here. And she goes, I'm not coming. Which you can imagine how he might have felt there. He goes on to say he gets mad, and he asks his eunuchs, what should we do about this? He says something needs to be done. According to our law, what should we do? And his eunuchs had an interesting answer, actually. It seemed like they took it more personal here, or at least they were a little more afraid about it than he was. He says, this goes down to verse 16, then Memucan said in the presence of the king and his officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath and plenty. So they're afraid of what this might do for the general culture that they're in. If the queen was willing to defy the king, then what will the rest of the common folk do? And how will their women treat their men? And so they say to him, something needs to be done about this. And so what do they tell him to do? It says, if it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and Medes, so that it may not be repealed. So once it went out from the king, you couldn't take it back. That Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom for his vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. This advice pleased the king and the princes, and he did as they proposed. So he sends out this letter to try to mitigate this damage, basically. Like, all right, we're going to nip this in the bud. Now, again, we're looking for God's hand in this. This was kind of crazy. This queen tells her king, I'm not coming. We don't get a reason why she was doing that. We have this clue that maybe she felt like she had better things to do. It says she was giving a feast for the women. So maybe they were partying it up, and she was like, no, my party's better. I'm hanging out here. We don't know exactly why she didn't come, but she was disobedient, and it wasn't going to fly. And so looking for God's hand, let's see what comes from her not doing that. So after these things, this is in chapter 2, after these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had been abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. I read some commentaries on this. It said that when he says he remembered what she'd done, it was more in lines of remembering her and like his care for her and how now she can't come into his presence forever. And so he was probably a little sad or feeling some type of way about that. And it says, the king's young men who attended him say, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king. And let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa the citadel, where he's at, under custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This pleased the king, and he did so. You can imagine that pleased the king. They said to him, hey, why don't we go into all your provinces? He's got 127 provinces. He said, let's go get beautiful young virgins from every province, and we'll bring them to you. And he said, yeah, I think you're onto something. You might be onto something there. Let's try that one out. It's different times. So they would go through a beautifying process. It says, let their cosmetics be given them. And now this is where we're going to get introduced to Mordecai. Now, mind you, at this time in history, the Jews had been exiled. The Israelites had been exiled originally by King Nebuchadnezzar, and now they're living amongst the Persian Empire. And they're living peacefully there, as far as we know. You'll see later on in the story that when this thing happens that most of the people around the Jews didn't understand why this was happening, this bad thing that's going to happen. And so we're led to believe that they were living peaceful, that the Jews were a peaceful people. They don't go looking for trouble, although God, when they first came into the promised land, gave them some orders and different things to eradicate some peoples. They weren't much like the Lord. His hopes were that they take no pleasure in the demise of the wicked, that it was just something they had to do to eradicate these people that had gone all bad, much like the heart of God in the flood. He looked down, he said he saw that all the thoughts of men were bad all the time. This wasn't just a people that were doing some bad things sometimes. They weren't just being selfish here and there, or maybe one of them had some adultery. That's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about little mistakes. We're talking about a people who all the thoughts were bad all the time. It's kind of hard to imagine. I mean, for me, I've got a past, a lot of you guys know it, where I made lots of mistakes and whatnot, but all my thoughts weren't bad all the time, So it's kind of hard, I think, for most of us to imagine that. But that's the heart of God, is that it makes me think actually of Abraham when God was going to go destroy Sodom. Abraham came to him, and I think Abraham was a little taken aback. His cousin Lot was in the city there, and he goes, "Are you going to destroy the righteous with the wicked, God? Far be it from you to do such a thing." And so there's this banter that goes back and forth between God and Abraham, and it seemed a little courageous on Abraham's part the way it ensued, because he starts asking him, "Well, wait a minute. If there's 50 people there, will you save the city for them?" And he goes, yeah, there's 50. I'll save it for those 50. And he goes, well, wait a minute. What if there's 5 missing from the 50? Well, you do it for 45. And he keeps going back and forth with God like that. And when I first read it, I thought to myself, wow, he's got it set on him there. He's going back and forth with God all the way down to, it gets down to 10 people. And God says, yes, if for 10 people's sake, if there's 10 righteous people in Sodom, I won't destroy it. Well, as most of you probably know, Sodom got destroyed. So that tells you what the deal was in Sodom. There wasn't even 10 there that were righteous. This was an entire city among another city, Gomorrah, that was just all bad, and it had to go. So let's see continue on here a little bit with in Esther. So now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Coincidentally, we don't learn a ton about Mordecai in here as far as his character and what he was all about, but there are some things that we can deduce from his behavior and how he did. Him raising Esther as his own is a godly thing to do. James talks about that true religion to God the Father is this, to keep oneself without spot from the world and to take care of orphans and widows in their time of distress. And so Mordecai willingly taking on the daughter of his uncle, I guess that'd be his cousin, as his own, the young woman was, that was a godly thing to do. So he's raising it as his daughter. And so this order goes out for the whole virgins to be brought to the king thing, and she is brought in. Esther is brought in as one of them. And Mordecai gives her some advice. He says, well, really in order, he says, don't tell them you're a Jew. Don't reveal anything about, who you are in that way. And she was obedient to that order. Now it says, So it says in verse 10 of chapter 2, Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was doing and what was happening to her. So he was checking on her all the time, too. He obviously cared for her a lot. Now when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was a regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for women. When the young woman went into the king this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Shagaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. So they've got a harem, and then he just described a second harem. And so the first harem, she's spending all this time in this beautification process for 12 months. They're softening her skin. They're making her smell good. They're doing all sorts of things to get her ready for the king. Once she's gone into the king, then she goes to the second harem, where the concubines are at. So she may or may not see the king again after this. It says she would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. So remember that summoned by name part. Says when Esther, the daughter of Abiel, the uncle of Mordecai, was taken, when she went into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had the charge of them, advised. So it said again she could take some things in with her. He advised her to take nothing but whatever it is she took. She listened to that advice. So she listened to Mordecai's advice, not revealing who she was. She listened to Haggai's advice, not taking anything but what she should take. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the other women. And she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. And so he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. And so we have this picture of this favor that's over Esther. And I see it coming from obedience. It comes from both God's provision and his grace and from the things that she was obedient to. We don't know what would have happened right off the bat if she had revealed she was a Jew. And we don't know what would have happened if she had not listened to Haggai's advice, this guy who's in charge of the concubines or the women, in going into the king. But we do know that she listened to them both. And so she has an obedient heart. And what came out of that was not only that she ended up getting the crown, she ends up replacing Queen Vashti, but there was this remission of taxes to the provinces and gifts given with royal generosity, and so others benefited from it too. So continuing on, it makes a note that she had still not revealed who she was as far as her kindred and her people. And so this thing comes about. It says in chapter 2, verse 21, in those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So something happened. These guys are mad about the king. They're possibly plotting against him. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai. And he told it to Queen Esther. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. So he tells Esther, who just happens to be in the right place. He's in the right place at the right time, and she happens to be in a position to do something with this information. And when the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So they just got some favor from the king there because he might have been under physical duress there. Who knows what they were going to do to him, but they exposed this plot, and they bring it to his attention. And there's going to be some favor that comes from that. So after these things, now we're going to get introduced to Haman. Now Haman, it says, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, son of Hammedatha. So Haman, interesting thing about Haman, it says he's the Agagite. Now there was another Agagite, King Agag, who, anybody remember him? King Agag? So Saul, there was some disobedience that happened around King Agag. Saul, who became king of Israel, the first king of Israel, he was given directions from Samuel, but from God, that said, hey, go in here, wipe out these people, the Amalekites, and wipe out all of them, let no one alive, and not only that, but kill all their livestock as well. Let nothing survive, devoted all to destruction. And there's this scene where Samuel, following this, they go in there and they wipe everybody out, almost. And Samuel shows up and he goes, why am I hearing the sound of sheep? Why am I hearing the bleating of sheep and rams? And what is happening here? And he sees King Agag as well, because Saul, for whatever reason, sought to keep King Agag alive, and he let the people take all this livestock. And this drama ensues where Samuel rebukes him and said, you've lost the favor of God. You needed to be obedient to God. He told you to do this thing. Why did you not do it? And so Samuel ends up hacking Agag to pieces. He takes care of that, but it doesn't speak to what happened to the livestock. Now, super interesting about this, I was wondering, because if Agag was killed and all the rest were devoted to destruction, then how is this guy a descendant of Agag? He's an Agagite, right? Descendant of an Amalekite. Well, I looked into it a bit, and this isn't, I don't know this to be the truth, because this is not in the Bible, but this is from a prominent Jewish teacher who said that at that time that they believed the Amalekites had sorcerers among them that could change people into animals, or at least to look like animals. And so it made sense to me then in rereading that the reason God said, hey, wipe out all the animals too, is because they might be masquerading as animals. That they might get away, these people, from you and disguising themselves somehow, whether it be by sorcery or maybe just fur. I don't know. I mean, we know about, what was it? It was Jacob. Jacob went in and received the blessing of Esau by putting animal fur on his forearms. So it's not an unheard of thing to disguise, and that was one of God's people, disguising themselves to get what they wanted. And so something happened regardless, where Haman was able to come into existence because the Amalekites were not dealt with. Now let's see what happens from there. It says, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, why do you transgress the king's command? And when they had spoke to him day after day, and he would not listen to them, they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, that he was a Jew, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. So again, I think there's a compare and contrast there. You've got Haman, this guy who was elevated to this high position, and then he's got Mordecai, this guy that he doesn't even know. He's out in the courtyard, but he won't bow down to him. And everybody else is, mind you, but not this guy. And so in hearing about this and seeing this and in hearing who his people are, he says it's not enough for him to just take out Mordecai. He wants to take out all the Jews. And so that's the spirit that's in him. Little, again, trivia about the Amalekites, or the spirit of Amalek, who was Esau's grandson. Esau ended up trading, Esau was Jacob's brother. He was the firstborn, but Jacob came out grabbing Esau's heel. And so Jacob's name meant like he who grabs the heel, or he who cheats. And so this plays out when they were younger, that Esau was out hunting. He was a great hunter. And Jacob was at home when he was making some food and some stew, it says. And Esau comes home, and we're assuming from what transpires that he must have been gone a while, and he probably didn't have any luck at hunting, because he comes walking in the door, he sees the stew, and he says, "Hey, give me some of that stew, I'm starved." And Jacob's response is, "Well, sell me your birthright, and I'll give you some stew." Now, the birthright was a big deal. Birthright, he was a firstborn son. He was going to get an inheritance, a blessing. It was a big deal, and it was something from God that he would get this thing. Well, he says yes. He goes, "Well, what good is that to me? I need some food." And so, again, we have to assume, I feel like you have to assume that he was really, really hungry, first off. Not that justifies it, but that it's just crazy if he wasn't. You know what I mean? If he could have waited until he made his own pole stew and he still sold his birthright, that's nuts. And it's still pretty nutty. Especially in light of things that Jesus said that, I have food that you know nothing about. My food is to do the will of him who sent me, and fasting for 40 days. Him, Moses, Elijah, there's people that have done things for the Lord around food that it seemed like he could have waited a minute. But he didn't think it was worth waiting for, and that's the part that I think that is relevant here. The spirit of Esau, that I believe becomes a spirit of Amalek, is a spirit that doesn't think the things of God is important. It doesn't think the blessings of God is important. It thinks that it thinks that its judgments are more important. That the way it sees things is more important than the way God sees things. That maybe even that the blessings that it can provide, itself is better than the blessings that God can provide, which is, as we know, nuts. But it's there, all the same. And so this spirit, and it's in Haman, this would be the spirit of the Amalekites. Same thing he got from his descendants. And so this hatred is a spirit that seeks to destroy the things of God. And Jews being God's people, he says, I want to destroy them all. It's not enough that one. And maybe he thought that it was just a given that if Mordecai wasn't going to bow down to him, that none of them were going to bow down to him. And that he just couldn't accept that. Which, really think about that, makes me think of, Isaiah 43 maybe, where it talks about Satan. And it makes some I statements where he's saying, I'm going to ascend on high, and I. This Haman was obviously very proud, and he could not accept that this guy would not bow down to him. And, Mordecai, it doesn't say explicitly that that Mordecai was not doing it because it was against his religion. We assume that he was, because the Ten Commandments, we will not have no God, we're not going to bow down to any other gods. But also, he probably knew the lineage of Haman. And so him being related to Agite, he wasn't going to bow down to him. It just wasn't going to happen. And so let's see what comes out of this. Haman, going down to verse 8. This is chapter 3, verse 8. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put in the king's treasuries. So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman the Agite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the money is given to you, and the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you. And so Aman brings this story saying that these people don't even keep your laws, which was not the case. That these were a peaceful people that were keeping the laws, other than maybe not bowing down to Haman. But he puts it to the king in a way that the king says, sure, they're in your hand, do what you wish. Now, there's an assumption here, too, that maybe he does not know that Esther is a Jew. He does not necessarily know the Jews very well. He may think that there's not that many of them, that this is just some remote amount of people in his empire that for whatever reason Haman has noticed they don't follow his laws, so yeah, we're better off without them. Well, there was quite a few Jews in his land, but he gives Haman the go-ahead. And so they put out these orders in every script and every language. It goes out to all the provinces, and did I miss the part about, I think we missed a pretty important part here. I'm going to go back real quick where it says, part about the lots. There it is, 3:7. So in the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th month, which is the same month as Passover, actually, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is, they cast lots, before Haman day after day, and they cast it month after month, till the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus those things. So this casting lots, that's something we don't really say too often in our day and age, but that's basically like dice for us, except it wasn't for fun. It wasn't for gambling or that sort of thing. It was to try to find the will of God. Now, Haman not being a Jew, he's going to be seeking after the will of his gods, whoever he was seeking counsel from there. But looking for the hand of the only God, as he went through, throwing these, and we don't know that they were dice exactly for them. They could have been different shaped stones, sticks, drawing straws sort of situation. They cast these things, and they did it for each day of the month, and they did it for each month of the year, and they landed on the last month of the year. It says the 12th month, or second to last, I think, because they had 13 months. And so it's basically 11. They were doing this in the first month, and they set it for 11 months from now. And so this edict that goes out, they're going to destroy the Jews on this second to last month. It's going to be 11 months down the road. And so you see God's hand in that it could have been, as they were rolling those dice, it could have been that month, 2 weeks from now, and they would have presented that to the king, and he would have said, all right, do what you wish. They had about 2 weeks to prep for this thing that's happening here, but they didn't. The thing went all the way through until 11 months out. And that's what they set the date. And so Mordecai comes. This edict goes out. The Jews just start going into turmoil. They start fasting and weeping, and they're putting on ash and sackcloth, which is what their custom was, is they're in mourning because they just got this order that goes. So they don't understand that on this certain day that anybody who wants to can come annihilate them. Just go and completely wipe out the people, man, woman, and child, and there's nothing they can do about it. And so Mordecai, when he learned all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out in the midst of the city and cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went up into the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. So Esther finds out about Mordecai being out there at the gate. He's mourning, he's in ash. She sends somebody to ask him what is going on, and he comes, they go and ask him what's going on, and Mordecai told him of all that happened to him and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, so that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. And Hatak went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hatak and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, this is chapter 4, verse 11, all the king's servants and the king's people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside of the inner court without being called, so he hasn't sent for them, there is but one law to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come to the king these 30 days. So Mordecai is seeking Esther's help, as most people would. She's in a position to do something about it. And he tells her what's going on, and she says, I can't go in and talk to him. If I go in there, he'll kill me unless he holds out the golden scepter to me. And she has no reason to think in that moment that she has his favor, that he will do that, because he hasn't called her into him in 30 days. You would think, he'd want to see his queen sooner than that if he was happy with her, right? And so she's got these assumptions rolling down in her head, and she's going, I can't do that. And then they told Mordecai what Esther had said, and this is what he says to her, and this is a scripture that a lot of people know, very pertinent for us. It says, then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise up for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. That scripture strikes me. It always does, because for a couple of reasons. I mean, obviously there's the challenge at the end, but it's actually Mordecai's confidence that gets me. He doesn't say, well, it may work out if you don't do this. He says, for if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise up from the Jews from another place. He had a faith in him of God that sounded pretty rock solid. He knew that God was going to deliver his people one way or another, even though he was mourning in ashes, which is hard for me to understand. To me, going into having that sort of faith, I always aspire to not let things grieve me, to look for God's hand in them, to even when it seems seemingly terrible news, God has shown me that he can do incredible things with it. And so if I know that going into it, it seems like it should change the way I experience the news. That's been my experience to some degree. But regardless, he says to her, relief will come for us if you don't do this. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you're not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. From the story, I think we can guess that God put her, we can see clearly that God put her exactly where she needed to be to do something about this. Whether or not she will or not, we'll see. She has free will. We all do. But she's in the spot to do something. So let's see what she says back to him. She says, then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf. And do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything that Esther had ordered him. So what's interesting to me, again, we talked about at the beginning of this, is that this doesn't mention God. It doesn't say, she didn't say, go and pray for me. She said, go, hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, and I'll do the same, and then I'll go in, and if I perish, I perish. So it's an opportunity to look for God here. They're Jews, they're God's people. Whether or not, for whatever reason, the author didn't mention it here, but it's implied. And that's what my Jewish friend actually told me the other day, too. He's, the Jewish rabbi. He said it's implied. It's implied that they are seeking after the Lord, that, there's only way they were going to get deliverance from this is from the Lord. An edict just went out in a large kingdom that said your entire people will be wiped out. What exactly are they going to do about that? So it's implied that God is going to help them. And so faith, I guess you could say faith is implied. So Esther goes on to prepare a banquet. I'm not going to read all of this, but I'll just summarize it, that she prepares this banquet. And meanwhile, Haman is still kicking back and forth, and he's still seeing Mordecai not bowing down to him. He's getting frustrated, more and more frustrated as the time passes. And Esther goes in to see the king, and she stands at the edge of the throne room, and he goes ahead and he holds out the golden scepter to her. And that was her saving grace there, that he did have favor for her. So she approaches him, and he says, "What can I do for you, Queen?" And he says this kind of trademark phrase you see a few different times in the Bible, where he says, "I'll give you whatever you want, up to half my kingdom." And all she says is, "Can you come to a feast that I prepared for you and bring Haman with you?" And he goes, "Yeah, of course, we'll come to the feast." So they go to the feast, and then he asks her again as they're eating. He goes, "All right, so what is your wish? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Even to half my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." And she goes, "My wish and my request is, if I found favor in the sight of the king, if it please the king, grant my wish and fulfill my request. Let the king and Haman come to a feast that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do the same thing, and I will do as the king has said." And so Haman leaves this, this gathering, and the fact that the queen has invited him and him only, along with the king, to come to another feast, he's feeling pretty good about this. And he goes back to his house, and he's with his wife, and he's with his sons, and he starts bragging to them. And he starts bragging about all his accomplishments and everything that God, that their gods has done for him, and he's just really getting into this. And he tells them, it says, even Queen Esther, this is chapter 5, verse 12, even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast she's prepared, and tomorrow also I'm invited by her together with the king. Yet all this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting in the king's gate. Then his wife Zeresh and all her friends said to him, let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast. The idea pleased Haman, and so he had the gallows made. And so it says 50 cubits. A cubit was 18 inches, so this is about 75 feet tall. He has this gallows made at his house for Mordecai, and he plans on going in the morning and going, hey, king, this guy Mordecai, he's got to go. Can you hang him on it? And so he's feeling good about that. He's going like, yeah, this is the way this is going to go. I like it. I'm with this plan. Well, on that night, and we're looking for God here, chapter 6, on that night the king could not sleep. And he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written how Mordecai was told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, what honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? Because he's remembering, as you remember earlier in the story, that Mordecai's hanging out by the gate. He overhears these two eunuchs talking in an angry way about the king, plotting something against him. He tells Esther, she tells the king, these two are put to death, and the king is saved. Well, this night, he can't sleep. They start reading him from basically, it sounds like a bedtime story to me, but it's just a history book of their deeds. And they start talking about these two that were plotting against him and how Mordecai saved him. And he goes, wait a minute, did I ever do anything for Mordecai for this? And the king's young men who attended him said, nothing's been done for him. And the king said, who's in the court? I love this part. He says, now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows. So Haman just walked in. And mind you, these guys advised the king. So when he said, who's out in the court, he was asking for one of his advisors, somebody who could come in and talk with him and advise him on what he might do for Mordecai. So he says, Haman is there standing in the court, and the king said, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? And Haman said to himself, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? And Haman said to the king, with that in mind, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and that the horse the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. So he just told the king, go all out. Go all out for this guy who's pleasing to you. I mean, I can take a guess who you're talking about, king, but you just go all out for this guy. Have somebody awesome to bring somebody awesome in to dress him and then go proclaiming before him in the streets how awesome he is, right? And so the king goes, this sounds like a great idea. I think this is awesome, Haman. This is a great suggestion. And it says, this king said to Haman, hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you've said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. You imagine Haman's face right now? It had to be good. It had to be good. I would have been a fly on the wall. It would have been awesome. So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house mourning with his head covered. And now there's some interesting advice here that comes out of this. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him, right? So he tells them this embarrassing story of what just took place. Then his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but surely fall before him. And so I would think that his wife was giving him a bit of a warning there. She's going, there's something going on here. If he's of these people, you better watch out. Which, again, looking for the hand of God was a good warning because, whether she knew it or not, she was right in saying, he better watch out for the God of Jacob and Abraham and Mordecai. So while they were still talking, chapter 6, verse 14, just next verse, while they were yet talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to take the Haman to the feast that Esther prepared. And so he comes to this feast. He's probably still in mourning, but at least he's feeling good about getting to go to this feast with them, like as he was before. And now the king approaches Queen Esther again. He says, "What is your request? It shall be granted to you." She says, verse 3, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king." And so that phrase, if we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent. It's a statement of humility. She's going, listen, I wouldn't even ask for this, because I think if we were just sold as slaves, that your loss of me would be bad. And so, but we're going to be annihilated here. His response is, then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he and where is he who has dared to do this?" And Esther said, "A foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. And so this plot comes out. It's exposed that Haman has geared this thing not only against the Jewish people, but now in turn to King Ahasuerus' wife, his queen, who he's very pleased with. And so it says, the king arose in his wrath, verse 7, and rose from his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden, but Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther. So he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And so the king gets up basically in a rage and just walks out, like doesn't even know what to do in that moment. Again, he's used to turning to advisors. What do I do about this? Well, his advisor's the one that's devised this terrible plan against him. And so he walks out. And then he walks back in after a few moments, and that time Haman has started to kind of grovel at Esther, going like, "Save us from this thing." We can only imagine what he's saying to her, but it says he was trying to beg for his life. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. Now this was a big no-no. This was being alone on the same couch as the queen, just not something you did. And the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?" As the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance of the king, said, "Moreover, if that wasn't enough, king, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king." So this guy who saved you, remember, king, you just honored him? There's a gallows 75 feet tall over at Haman, who he was going to plan on hanging Mordecai on. And the king said, "Hang him on that. Hang Haman on that." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king abated. So not only did, it goes on from there that they find out that not only did they save Queen Esther and expose this plot, but her and Mordecai asked the king to do something about it. But you may remember earlier on that he had said that an edict that goes out from him with the king's ring on it can't be taken back. And so once that thing went out that the Jews were going to be wiped out on that day, he couldn't take that back. And so all he could do was make a new one. And so what they do is they get a new edict that says on that day that the Jews can defend themselves however they see fit, anybody who shows aggression against them. So they do that. Now, mind you, earlier on it said that a lot of the people who saw this edict were very confused by it, the original edict. They're going, why would we rise up and kill all the Jews? What's happening here? But there were some enemies of the Jews who were stoked about that. They were going to take their, kill them and take their goods and just capitalize on this moment to get rid of some of their enemies. Well, when the Jews get this secondary edict from the king and they go out, on that day they're able to defend themselves, and they do. They defend themselves against those who come after them. They asked actually for a second day to be able to do the same thing, that if there's anybody showing aggression to them, that they would take them out, and they would therefore rid themselves of their enemies. Well, part of the original edict was that they could take the plunder. The people who killed the Jews could take their stuff and their plunder. Well, the Jews took none of the plunder, it says. And so, let's see where it says it on here. So it's in chapter 9. Actually, I think it's in 8, sorry. Verse 11, it says, no, starting at 10. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring that he sent the letters by mounted courier. These letters go out. Down at verse 13, a copy was written, was to be issued as a decree in every province, being publicly displayed to all people. And the Jews were ready on that day to take vengeance on their enemies. So somewhere down there it talks about how they don't take any plunder for themselves. And so I didn't understand that. I'm thinking to myself, there's all these people, and they took out a ton, because he comments on it. The king goes, wow, they've taken out a ton of people. Just in our city, they destroyed 500 men, chapter 9, verse 6. But they took no plunder, and I'm thinking, why didn't they take the plunder? And so I had to do a little research on this. And they devoted that basically to God, that God was their portion, that his provision, his faithfulness, what he had done for them was all the plunder they needed. You know what I mean? They were content with their God and his faithfulness and his provision for them. And so it says, down in 9 verse 15, but they laid no hands on the plunder. Now, in verse 16, now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives and got relief from their enemies and killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but they laid no hands on the plunder. So after this, the Feast of Purim is inaugurated, and on this day, since then, they have celebrated the Feast of Purim. And it's a holiday to commemorate the faithfulness of God. And there's story after story. You study the Old Testament, and you see story after story. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Daniel in the lion's pit, the Israelites coming to the Red Sea. There's just a plethora of things that God has done, miraculous things he's done, like these events that transpired that some could maybe look at and think, oh, well, good thing, right place, right time, yada, yada. No, you had to have the exile. You had to have the Mordecai and Esther in the right place with God's favor, and all the things that transpired to get her to the place that this could be exposed and averted. And not only that Haman was put to death, and all of his sons were put to death. And so there's a portion here going back to what we talked about with King Agag and his descendants, this Agite, where now all those descendants are taken out. And so God's original command was actually fulfilled in this. It doesn't state whether or not they were absolutely the last of the Amalekites or these descendants, but we got to see God's hands at work in that. And so I think the good news for us is that God's still doing that. But here's the caveat, is much like Esther, we have to look for it. I didn't have to go through a Red Sea on the way here. If I did, if I had came to a Red Sea partition on the way here and prayed and God had moved that, we think of that as like a huge testimony of faith, right? It'd just be undeniable, just be absolutely undeniable. He parted the sea on the way here. But he did do it. He did do it in here, and he does it for us on a daily and weekly basis. My wife just told me we've decided to go into full-time ministry, and I was recently praying, and as you might imagine, there's some stresses that can come out of that. Worldly things, but things we all need, provision, right? And as I started to think about that, I was praying, and I thought to myself, I was praying to God, and I was going, God, but I have no clue what we need for this coming week is coming from. And he responded immediately. He goes, yeah, but you didn't know that last week either. Or the week before that either. And I just sat with that for a minute, and I was like, that is very true. I did not. And yet it came. And so as we got him in here today, something happened that transpired that answered that question for the next week. And so, God is faithful, and he meets our needs, and he makes a way. And here was a really encouraging word, and I'm going to wrap up, but a really encouraging word from the Lord that I got just sitting here as I was feeling nervous, and a brother came up and talked to me and said, don't be nervous. And I was praying, because I'm always doing that before I get up here. God said to me, I've taken into consideration your shortcomings, which is really good news, because I'm hyper, aware of my shortcomings, very self-critical sometimes. But as far as it goes at getting up here and trying to share God's word from you and the different barriers that might come up in that, whether it be fear, pride, ego, anxiety, to know that God, that doesn't catch him off guard. He's not like, oh, I didn't know you were going to be that nervous. I didn't know, you know what I mean? And you see that all over this, because this could have gone a very different way. The story of Esther, there's all sorts of wrenches that could have been thrown in that could have sidetracked this, you could say, but there's nothing that God didn't see coming. There's nothing that God ever doesn't see coming, ever. And so when we have these problems, when we have financial worries, when we have health worries, when we have family worries, there's nothing that God didn't see coming. There's nothing that catches them and makes them go, oh, you know what I mean? Like, that's not a God thing. He knows. He saw it, that he's made a way through it, and he can bless us with it and use it for our good. And so, that's it. Praise the Lord and praise Jesus, and I'm going to pray us out here.